Today I'm going to answer a few questions about securing letters of recommendation for your law school applications. Although Harvard only requires 2 letters of rec, I actually opted to submit 3. 2 were from my undergraduate professors, and then the third was from one of my supervisors at the company I worked at prior to law school. If you are applying to law school straight from college, it is totally okay to submit 2 or more academic letters of recommendation. This is because, first, HLS understands that you may have little work experience coming out of college. And second, I think that what they care about most is to hear from recommenders that can attest to your academic or legal related skills, like research and writing. As for the timing for asking for letters of rec, this depends on when you intend on applying to law school. In my case, when I was in college, I knew I wanted to apply to law school after working for a couple of years. Thus, my spring semester of senior year, I asked both my professors if they'd be willing to write me a letter of recommendation when I was ready to apply. That following year, I sent the check-in email to remind them of my intentions and secure their availability. Then, in the August before my application cycle, I formally asked them to submit their letters of recommendation within a certain time frame. Even though I knew I was going to take time off in between college and law school, I wanted to still secure letters of recommendation while I was in school because my relationships with those professors would still be fresh. If you have already been out of school and have not yet secured your academic letters of recommendation, that is okay as well. I would still recommend reaching out to at least one professor or someone who could attest to your skills in an academic setting. Also, when you reach out, be sure to include a paper or other assignment that you worked on for them to help jog their memory. As for the who, substance is always more important than the status. Like the other components of the application, letters of recommendation are another opportunity for admissions to get to know you. Thus, you want to submit letters of recommendation from people that can provide specific examples of how you worked together or performed on an assignment. If you worked closely with the dean of your college on a research project and want to ask them for a letter of recommendation, that's great. However, a letter of rec from a professor that you took 2 classes and formed a relationship with is just as fantastic.
So letters of recommendation, I believe that Harvard requires 2 to 3 letters of rec, either for people who you've worked with or professors that you've taken courses with. I did 3 letters of recommendation just to cover all of my bases. I do not recommend submitting any more. In fact, I do not think they will look at any more than 3. So the 3 that I submitted were 1 from a professor in undergrad, who I took 2 classes with. I asked him if he could write something for me, if he knew me well enough to be able to write anything about me. I also sent my resume just to make sure that he had enough to mention as well, so I think that that's something great that you can do. The second letter of recommendation that I got was from my graduate supervisor. So I took a year to go to get my master's and felt like my supervisor knew me well enough to be able to speak to my work there, my ability to write as well, and also research. So I felt that that was also a good letter of recommendation to have. By no means do you have to have 2 academic letters of recommendation. I just felt that it was best for me, seeing as I had been at 2 institutions. The third one that I received was from my employer. So I took a year to work at an immigration law firm, and I thought that that would be a great opportunity to get a letter of recommendation. So I asked the lawyer that I primarily worked with if he felt comfortable enough with the work that I turned in to speak about my research and writing as well, because that's what I was primarily doing, and had him write a letter of recommendation for me.
I happen to love letters of recommendation, and one of my favorite things about a letter of recommendation is they can come from pretty much anyone, and they can touch on really sweet and really nuanced parts of your personality and tell stories. I think it's a great addition to an application and certainly should not be taken for granted. So for instance, I use some administrators who I had worked with during my time at my undergraduate college. I used professors who helped me figure out that I wanted to do law school in the first place. And I used professors that I had maybe not the best grades with in their class, so it wasn't like an A++ or anything like that, but that I had robust conversations with that could speak to my analytical skills. I would say one of the best ways to think about a letter of recommendation and who you should be asking is what it's going to supply to your application. So for instance, you just heard me say that I had a professor who could speak to my analytical skills. So I had a professor who did not politically agree with me on everything, but was in a class and in a seminar where we regularly talked through things, why we had particular policy positions, what supported those policy positions, what evidence was I using, etc., etc. And so I knew, one, that I asked him if he could write a positive letter of recommendation for me. He said yes. And then I knew he would be able to speak to that because that's what we had in common. One of my other professors, who was a critical feminist professor at UC Davis, she was able to talk about how I could engage with the law, that she would be excited to see somebody like me bring my experiences in and be able to have a critical lens on the law. Again, I was very strategic in my letters of recommendation, trying to make sure that each person who was submitting something wasn't going to be telling the same story and was going to be able to speak to a particular skill that may not have been fully captured in my personal statement or other aspects of my application. A really great question that gets asked around, do you go for the status or do you go for the substance when it comes to letters of recommendations? And I would say, I don't know if I ever got really good advice about what to do. I would say the majority of people said, get letters from people who can really speak to who you are as a person. And so that's the substantive. I would say, I had more people say, get the people who can actually speak to who you are, not just the status symbol person. And I think part of that is that there is a fear or a caution that the person who's the dean, who you maybe had one conversation with, can't really speak to who you are. But I would say the jackpot scenario is if you can find somebody who has the status and can speak to you, to who you are as a person. So I worked for a California state senator for 2.5 years before I came to law school. I had her write my letter of recommendation. And so that was somebody who was an elected official in a state like California. And yes, I'm very biased because I'm from California. So obviously the best of the best state senators, but she wrote my letter of recommendation and actually allowed me to work with her to write it. And so I knew that it was going to be a really strong letter of recommendation from someone with status. So I would say don't all of a sudden abandon status, but I would say it does need to be able to be, at least one page around who you are, not just, great guy, great girl, great person. They did wonderful things. And yeah, that's it. No. You want somebody who can tell a story, who can speak to your character, and who can add something. So again, it's I'm kind of answering the question, do you go for status or do you go for substance? I would say it's a bit of both. The magical combination is if you can have both, and I would certainly say lean into that.